Welcome to the second part of our lecture on nationalism in Europe. And we left off with the revolutions of 1848 and now returning to France, where we have a republic. There was a new constitution, new government. We have one legislative body, the National Assembly, and an elected president. And you might recall that the man they elected as president was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. And so the Constitution had actually stipulated that he could only serve for one term, and towards the end of that term, he actually proposed that he should be allowed to run again. This would probably require revising the Constitution. He submitted his proposal to the National Assembly, and then they rejected it, at which point he used the army to seize control of the government. And, I know what you're thinking. Surely this can't be a good thing for maintaining a republic, but he is going to put it to the French people, right? They're going to have voting by universal male suffrage, right? Meaning there are no property qualifications involved, though of course only men can vote. And he's going to actually suggest that they restore the empire. So really, it's not even just a vote about keeping him in power. It's about whether to maintain the republic or the empire. And believe it or not, 97% of the French people vote to restore the empire. At which point he assumes the title Napoleon III out of respect for the first Napoleon's son. And some of you might be surprised by this, and obviously, given the series of revolutions leading up to this moment, supposedly in order to fulfill everything that the French Revolution had been about, this might seem a bit surprising. One has to imagine that a major factor here is in fact that he is a Napoleon, the idea of restoring the glory days of France and so forth. But in any event, from this point forward, we effectively have a dictatorship under Napoleon III. And it really is a dictatorship, right? As chief of state, Napoleon III controls the armed forces, the police, the civil service. They will maintain a legislative body. It's no longer the National Assembly. In its place, we have the Legislative Corps, whose members are elected by universal male suffrage. And in that respect, it is democratic, but it really has no power, right? So it really is more about the facade or the appearance of representative government. But I mean, for instance, and this is the primary, should be the primary prerogative of a legislative body. The Legislative Corps cannot introduce legislation. They can only vote on legislation that has been introduced by Napoleon III. So think about that. You have a legislative body that cannot legislate, and they also do not have the right to declare war, which is usually a power given to a legislative body. So for instance, in the United States, only the Congress can declare war. I mean, of course, U.S. presidents have found creative ways to get around that. But at least in principle, right, the idea that, only a body that represents the entire population should have the right to make that kind of monumental decision. Now, having said that, Napoleon III is going to prove to be very popular. In some regards, he is, if you're talking about domestic policy, things he's doing with respect to France internally, a lot of good things happening there. He does a lot to help develop the French economy. And, this is a period where the Industrial Revolution is really getting underway. So France is going to become a major industrialized power. We see iron production triple, a lot being done to develop infrastructure. And probably most famously, if you visit Paris today, in many ways you are seeing the Paris created by Napoleon III, right? They're going to bulldoze many of the narrow streets, eliminate many city walls, and in their place construct these really broad boulevards surrounded by very spacious buildings. For instance, if you're in Paris, if you go up the Eiffel Tower and you're looking around, and I've had the privilege of doing that a few times, it really does feel like this very kind of unified architecture, right? And a lot of that reflects the fact that a lot of the buildings you're seeing were constructed at the same time. and with a real eye towards how they're all going to come together, right, in terms of entire neighborhoods, in terms of kind of broader city planning and so forth. Now, a lot of the restructuring of Paris is also going to be, about kind of the infrastructure you don't necessarily see. They're going to develop like a really good underground sewage system, which, by the way, is actually I've not gone into the sewers in Paris, but you actually can do that as a tourist. They have, they bring in tourist groups to see the sewers, which supposedly are very beautiful. I can't speak for how they smell. We're going to see a new public water supply system created, gas lighting throughout the city, and so forth. So for that time, becoming very rapidly one of the most beautiful and modern cities in Europe, still one of the most beautiful and modern cities in the world. And to give you an idea about, we talked about these broad boulevards replacing the kind of narrow streets and alleys that had dominated Paris until then. Here we see a really good example of that. And of course, one major factor here is the good thing about broad boulevards, if you need to move the army around, much easier and much more difficult to throw up barricades, right, that might actually have any effect. So there is also kind of a consideration about maintaining power and preventing any kind of revolutionary activity from really gaining any momentum, should it happen in the future. Napoleon also is going to initiate policies that to some degree are very favorable to the working class. And in part he does this because you have a growing working class and it serves his interest to remain popular with them and also to diffuse any potential unrest that might come from that quarter. So in the 1860s, Napoleon III is going to reach out to the working class, for instance, by legalizing trade unions and granting workers the right to strike. And that is, by the way, something even perceived as almost sacrosanct in France today. But if you think about it, what he's doing is creating a kind of safety valve that will allow for the letting off of steam and also, kind of a mechanism for resolving any potential issues that under other circumstances could produce revolution. At some point, he is going to give the legislative corps a bit more say in the affairs of state, allowing for greater debate over the budget. So it's, kind of like opening things up just enough, right, to kind of quiet any of his critics, to prevent any opposition from really gaining traction. And then he does a really smart thing. When things are going pretty well and he's fairly popular, he puts it to a vote again, right? A plebiscite or referendum held in May 1870, about, whether are you happy with the way things are? Should we continue with empire? Or do you want to return to a parliamentary regime, right? To have a new constitution, go back to a kind of more democratic representative form of government. But as you might expect, right, he's only going to put it to a vote when things are going pretty well, and people are going to end up voting in favor of keeping things as they are, in favor of Napoleon. Now, so domestically, at home, you could argue, he's a dictator. I'm not going to say that's a good thing, but he's doing a pretty good job. His real problem is going to be abroad. And part of the problem there is, as a Napoleon, right, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, he feels this kind of constant pressure, right, to demonstrate, France's influence abroad, right, to demonstrate that France is a great power, to kind of live up to the reputation of his famous uncle. And that very often gets him into trouble. It also gets France entangled in things that really, there wasn't any real compelling reason for France to get involved in this or that enterprise. Like France didn't really stand to gain much. And a really good example of that is going to be France's, shall we say, Mexican adventure, right? So we're going to be looking at kind of developments in Latin America shortly, involving kind of more revolutionary movement, particularly in Mexico, where at some point we have a struggle between liberal and conservative factions kind of descending into civil war. Now, European involvement is really going to start with the British and the Spanish, both of whom have an interest in what happens in Mexico. For the Spanish, mostly in connection with the fact that it had been part of the Spanish Empire. The British, because they're very economically active in Latin America, including Mexico. And so they decide they're going to intervene in this kind of civil struggle in Mexico. On the side of the conservative faction, because really they just desire stability. I'm not justifying their involvement, but there is a rationale that makes some kind of sense. There's some kind of underlying logic, and this is in 1861. But France, in an effort to demonstrate that it is a great power and that anything involving other great powers should include France, is going to insist on joining with the British and the Spanish in sending troops into Mexico. At first, that doesn't really turn out to be much of a problem. The real problem is going to be after the British and Spanish withdraw and the French remain behind. And at this point, it's really difficult to explain why the French are still there, except that, Louis Napoleon feels this pressure to live up to the reputation of his uncle. Related to which, their involvement in Mexico is going to become even more profound. At some point, they're going to promote a new ruler over Mexico, the Archduke Maximilian of Austria, right, who they are basically going to put on the throne as Emperor of Mexico. And, just kind of think about that for a second, right? This is a Habsburg ruler from Austria, right, with no historical, linguistic connection with Mexico. I mean, there's really no reason why he should be in charge of Mexico. It's really more just the idea that, this is a way for France to demonstrate its influence, that they actually get to decide who's going to be in charge there. And he ends up being Maximilian of Mexico. The problem is, again, there's no real logic to him being the ruler of Mexico. He definitely does not enjoy any support there. And at some point, his ability to stay on the throne completely reliant on French support. When the French finally withdraw, everything goes south for him, right? He is eventually forced to surrender by liberal Mexican forces in May 1867, and shortly thereafter executed. And you have to imagine the last thought running through his head is, why, oh why, did I listen to Napoleon III? But in any event, this is, in many ways going to reflect very poorly on Napoleon III, right? The desired outcome, totally didn't work out, obviously reflected poor, kind of strategical considerations and so forth. In any event, at this point, we should turn to other developments in Europe, some of which eventually are going to lead to another war that will involve France, where things go a little bit better for France. We'll get to that shortly. But I need to provide some background about the Ottoman Empire first, right? So Ottoman Empire, coming into the 19th century, still a very sizable empire, considerable territory in Europe, in Southeast Europe, what today we call the Balkans. But probably, the imperial heartland is in what today roughly corresponds to Turkey. Most of what today are the Arabic-speaking countries, part of the Ottoman Empire. Looking at this map, you'd say that they're in pretty good shape, but actually, for a while now, they've been in a state of decline, at least militarily, and in terms of, losing a lot of battles, in terms of losing also a lot of territory. And this map kind of illustrates what is the emerging pattern, right? So you see, between 1807 1829, they lose, coded in yellow there, Bessarabia, present-day Moldova. Between 1830 1878, in orange, considerable amount of territory in Europe, including what today is Greece, much of what today are the former states of Yugoslavia, territories corresponding to Romania. And then after that, 1879 to 1915, pretty much everything in Europe and a good deal of North Africa. And in fact, by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, it is very commonly the case that the Ottoman Empire is referred to as the sick man of Europe, a nickname coined by the Russian Tsar, and in some ways Russia is now the primary nemesis of the Ottoman Empire, the one that they often find themselves at war with, and as a consequence, losing territory. But even it kind of goes back a bit further, right? So, if we want to talk about a period of decline for the Ottoman Empire, we might go back to 1699, where they lost control of Hungary, territory corresponding to Romania, Transylvania. Some of you probably heard of it, very famous, for vampire stories. Croatia and Slovenia. A lot of these territories went to the Austrian Empire, but then it's going to be increasingly the story that they're losing territory to Russia. 1783, they lose control of Crimea, which is that little peninsula jutting into the Black Sea from the northern perimeter. 1812, Russia will take control of Bessarabia, which today is known as Moldova. And by the way, a lot of this doesn't just reflect being at war with Austria or Russia. A lot of this reflects the fact that nationalism is becoming much more pervasive pretty much everywhere in Europe. And so you're going to have a lot of different groups, that are starting to define themselves in nationalistic terms within Ottoman territory that are going to, kind of be promoting the idea that they should break away from the Ottoman Empire and form an independent state based on that nationality, right? So, this is starting pretty early. 1817, we have nationalist revolts in Serbia, and that will lead to that country's independence from the Ottoman Empire. Shortly thereafter, we have Greece. The Greeks had been part of the Ottoman Empire. They're going to break away after a relatively long war of independence. Finally, having their own nation state in 1830. And then, sometimes Russia getting involved in these nationalist movements, usually in support of them. There's kind of two factors there. Many of these are Slavic-speaking people. So many Russians feel kind of an affinity for them, that they should support their ambitions of becoming independent. But also this is about geopolitics, right? Just taking advantage of the fact that there's, a group of people in the Ottoman Empire who are trying to revolt against Ottoman rule, to break away, form an independent state, and Russia sees an opportunity to gain influence regionally and within the Ottoman Empire. So, for instance, they're going to get involved in developments in territories that eventually will be part of Romania, Moldavia, not to be confused with Moldova, and Wallachia, which end up becoming protectorates of Russia in 1829. And just so you kind of get a sense of the geography here, eventually Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania coming together to form the state of Romania, right? Kind of based on the idea that the majority of the people living there are nationalistically Romanian, but that sense of Romanian national identity really only beginning to take form during this period. And so I mentioned there's going to be another conflict in Europe, one that will involve France, where things go a bit better for them. I should note they're going to be a bit on the periphery of it, but in any event, that war is the Crimean War. And before you can really understand how it came about, I need to provide a bit of background, such as it really has to do with Russia's relationship with the Ottoman Empire. And in many ways, the war is going to start out primarily between them, right? So we already talked about how Russia is very often at war with the Ottoman Empire. They've involved themselves in providing military support of these nationalist revolts that are taking place in Southeast Europe. There is a third way in which Russia is often making problems for the Ottoman Empire. And that reflects the fact that even in the Asian part of the Ottoman Empire, predominantly made up of people today we would identify as being either Turkish or Arab, but again, nationalism only beginning to get underway there. Most of them don't have a problem with Ottoman authority. Most of them are predominantly Muslim, but you do have a sizable Christian population even there, and the vast majority of them are Orthodox Christians, very much like the vast majority of Russians, Greek Orthodox as opposed to Russian Orthodox. But in any event, coming into the 19th century, you already have the case where Russia has asserted its right, sometimes formalized in treaties concluding wars, to be the protectors of Orthodox Christians living in the Ottoman Empire, inclusive of protecting their right vis-a-vis the various Christian shrines that we find there, particularly in Palestine, especially in Jerusalem, right? So, and sometimes they just assert this right as a pretext for intervening in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire. Sometimes it's motivated by a genuine concern that maybe Orthodox Christians are being oppressed in some way. But obviously the Ottoman Empire not too happy about that. What makes it more problematic is while the majority of Christians in the Ottoman Empire are Orthodox, not all of them are. You have a sizable Latin Catholic population, even other sects that are Catholic in the sense that they acknowledge the Pope. And France, from a pretty early point, had asserted its right to be the defender of Catholics in the Ottoman Empire. Somewhat ironic, given how much they often, French were attacking the Catholic Church, going back to the French Revolution. It used to be kind of a joke in diplomatic circles that the French are only Catholic abroad, right? They're secular at home. But in any event, right, why is that problematic? Well, very often relations between Catholics and Orthodox within the empire are not always good. Very often, primarily around who has ownership or who has rights with respect to the various Christian shrines in Palestine. So a really good example of that would be the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which you see here. Supposedly, according to Christian tradition, marking the place where Jesus was crucified and buried, a very important site of pilgrimage. And even until today, divided in its ownership between various sects of Christianity, probably the two most important ones being Latin Catholics and Greek Orthodox, right? So, there's different parts of the church are considered as being in the ownership of the one or the other. Also, some of the more important shrines within the building, maybe the Greek Orthodox have the right to use it during this time of the day. Latin Catholics have the right to use it at that time of the day, and so forth. And very often, a consequence of this is you have a lot of conflict between Catholics and Orthodox that end up drawing in their respective protectors, right? The Russians coming in on behalf of Orthodox, the French on behalf of Catholics. Whether they decide to get involved or not might really reflect more geopolitical considerations about, maybe related to the Ottoman Empire, maybe related to one another, a way to kind of diminish French influence or diminish Russian influence, so forth and so on. So what happens? In 1853, the Russians demanded the right to protect Christian shrines in Palestine, some of which, up until then, the respective privilege had really belonged to the French, right? Why are they doing this? Because an altercation had broken out between Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians in Bethlehem at the Church of the Nativity, right? Marking the place where, according to Christian tradition, Jesus Christ was born. I forget some of the details. I think the Catholics woke up one morning, this beautiful star that they had used to adorn the spot where supposedly Jesus was born was missing. They claimed the Orthodox had stolen it. I mean, really, sometimes some of the quarrels that would evolve seem very petty. You have stories in the 19th century, literally, of Catholic and Orthodox monks, just beating the living daylights out of one another. Swinging candelabras, punching each other on and so forth. But in any event, right, the Russians see this as an opportunity to increase their influence in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, from the French point of view, this would mean a diminishing of their influence. And Britain is at some point going to get involved. They're not really protecting anyone. They're trying very hard to find a religious group to protect. Eventually, they kind of informally settle on Jews, and that might be a factor later on in why they support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. But in any event, at some point, both France and Britain find themselves concerned about Russia becoming too influential in the Ottoman Empire. This is now becoming a balance of power consideration. And so on October 4th, obviously the Ottoman Empire also not happy about this, but not really certain that they want to declare war on Russia. Right? I mean, you don't want to start a war that you might lose. The British and French make it clear to the Ottoman Sultan that they have his back. Right? They encourage the Ottoman Empire to declare war, make it clear that they are prepared to go to war on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, and so war is declared on October 4th, initiating the Crimean War. So called because most of the fighting is going to center around the Crimean Peninsula, which you can see here right in the center. This kind of peninsula that's only slightly attached to the mainland that juts out into the Black Sea from the north. And this had been part of the Ottoman Empire, recently had become part of the Russian Empire, conquered during a war. Some of you might be thinking, gee, haven't we heard something about Crimea of late? More recently, it had been part of the Ukraine, but then Russia had actually gone in and militarily seized it. This became kind of the basis of something of an international crisis, the imposing of sanctions on Russia and so forth. All right, that happens later on, but kind of interesting to consider that Crimea featured very prominently in a conflict back in the middle of the 19th century. The long and short of it is that Russia is going to lose, right? After a long siege, mostly centered around the Russian fortress of Sevastopol, the fortress falls in September 1855, and pretty much that marks the end of the Crimean War, the defeat of Russia. Something very clear from the terms of the Treaty of Paris. Yes, another treaty ending a conflict signed in Paris. This one signed in March of 1856, forcing Russia to give up Bessarabia, Moldavia, and Wallachia. Right, territories, two of which will eventually become part of Romania. Bessarabia eventually will be drawn back into the Russian orbit in connection with when it becomes the Soviet Union. It ends up becoming a Soviet republic known as Moldova. By the way, the primary language there is not Russian; it's Romanian, kind of reflecting the historical connection from back in the day. Also, Russia will not be permitted to go through the Straits of Dardanelles and the Bosporus to access the Mediterranean, unless with Ottoman position, but there's going to be very strict regulations about the kind of ships that can go through and so forth. So, again, balance of power. Russia, this danger that Russia would become too dominant in the region has been contained. We should note one last thing in connection with the Crimean War. If you never heard really anything about the Crimean War, you might be familiar with the individual is probably the most famous person associated with it, and that would be Florence Nightingale, right? So she's this woman who went to the Crimea to tend to British soldiers, and it was a very brutal conflict. More than 250,000 soldiers died in the war, though most of them from disease, right? But she became very active there, and really actively promoted certain practices that today we associate with nursing, particularly those related to maintaining sanitary conditions and kind of establishing the link between that, the likelihood of recovery and so forth. She ends up saving many British soldiers. We should note there were other nurses involved, even though she's kind of the one that we often associate with these developments and, the one that we remember. Part of that does reflect that, like in real time during the Crimean War, reports were making their way back to Britain, and she became this kind of heroic figure. And so she ended up doing a lot to make nursing a respectable profession among middle-class women, right? And this is during the Victorian era in Britain where women weren't supposed to work at all, right? So this became like not only something they could do, it actually became so associated with them that it wasn't even really possible for a man to end up becoming a nurse, right? And it also became very popular. If you were a woman looking for, any way to have a kind of profession that took you out of the house, out of the domestic sphere, this became a real possibility. Obviously, something you could feel good about, and so forth. And it's kind of interesting to consider that even until today, we tend still to associate nursing, with women as somehow being a woman's profession. Some of you might have seen the film Meet the Parents, where a woman brings her fiance home to meet her parents. He's a male nurse, and people just somehow can't wrap their mind around that. You couldn't make it through medical school. It's like, no, I really wanted to be a nurse, right? And everyone kind of looking at him like, that just doesn't feel right. Something of that has carried over even until today. At this point now, we get to the main events, which are the, kind of completing the story of Italian and German nationalism, the final unification of both, right, where we end up with a German and Italian state in Europe. So we're going to look at Italy first. We left off with this series of revolts that had taken place in 1848. What seemed a nationalist movement on the cusp of unifying Italy in opposition to Austria under the leadership of Charles Albert, the king of Sardinia / Piedmont, but then in the end, it all fell apart. But you might remember one of the last things I mentioned is that at some point, political figures are going to realize that, maybe they shouldn't be afraid of nationalism, nationalist sentiment. Maybe this is something they can harness. And that is pretty much going to define the stories of both Italian unification and German unification. So looking at Italy first, right, where we left things off, Austria is still very much active in the northern part of Italy. You could even say the dominant power in Italy. And again, this goes back to even the 1830s, but it's even more the case now, right? That the hopes for unification are really focusing on this idea, right, of somehow rallying Italians in opposition to Austria, the idea that they're this foreign occupying force in the northern part of their future state, and that this should be under the leadership of the Italian state of Piedmont, right? Kingdom of Sardinia, but let's say Piedmont because really we're more interested in the land-based part of that kingdom, and very often just simply referred to as Piedmont. Again, the capital is Torino. This is just south of the Alps. And the key figure here, moving forward, is going to be Count Camillo di Cavour. He's not the king. He is the prime minister of Piedmont, but during the time of his ministry, he is definitely the dominant political figure in Piedmont. And he is not an Italian nationalist, but he recognizes it is something he can use in order to enhance the power of Piedmont and enhance the position of his king, King Victor Emmanuel II. And so from a pretty early point, he's actually got this plan of, eventually, initiating a war against Austria, or, maybe better to provoke Austria into declaring war on Piedmont. But he wants to make sure it's a war that Piedmont wins, and then as a consequence of which Piedmont would be able to expand its territory. Right? So he is going to prepare assiduously for this eventual conflict. And there are primarily two aspects to this preparation, right? One is a policy of economic expansion that will generate revenue that will allow him to develop a bigger army. And in fact, the area around Turin or Torino in Italy, one of the more industrialized parts of Italy, particularly in terms of car manufacture. The second part of the plan involves establishing a defensive alliance with France, right? And a defensive alliance meaning that if someone attacks Piedmont, France would be obligated to declare war on whoever that was, right? And so, with the pieces in place in 1859, he provokes Austria into invading Piedmont, And because Austria, to all appearances, started the war, France now obligated to declare war on Austria. And again, the main purpose here is simply to enhance Piedmont's power and expand its territory. But this is going to kind of set off a chain reaction. Right? So, first of all, the plan goes pretty well. Austria is defeated, and Piedmont ends up gaining territory formerly under Austrian rule. Lombardy, where the city of Milan is located, will be awarded to Piedmont. France, by the way, gets a few territories as well. It's kind of a bit of an exchange. These territories will come from Piedmont, but Piedmont gives up much less than they gain. The thing is, imagine if you're an Italian nationalist while all this is going on, right? So you have nationalists throughout Italy, many of them in neighboring states like Parma, Modena, and Tuscany, who are going to see this as an opportunity, right? So they immediately rise up, initiate revolts, overthrow their governments, but then turn their countries over to Piedmont, right? Because for them, this isn't about anything other than nationalism and eventually creating a unified Italian state. And so very quickly, pretty much all of the northern part of Italy has become united into one state. What about in the south? Well, that is where another very important figure is going to emerge, right? So Dicovod is kind of, more a political figure using nationalism, but really, kind of more old school. Using nationalism in order to achieve what are very conventional goals, right? Giuseppe Garibaldi is a revolutionary and a diehard nationalist. In some ways, even, shall I say, more of a revolutionary than a nationalist. If nothing was going on in Italy, usually traveling to points abroad looking for a revolution that he could fight alongside of. That very often led him to South America. By the way, occasionally he would stop off in Staten Island and hang out there a bit while in transit. The house where he used to stay has actually been converted into a little museum in Staten Island, if you're curious. And, he also is a very popular figure with anyone of Italian ancestry, right? So you'll find statues of him everywhere, including, for instance, in Washington Square Park. But in any event, right, as soon as word gets to him of what's going on in the northern part of Italy, he very quickly heads over to the southern part of Italy, raises up an army of red shirts, and this is effectively their uniform, right? They wear this kind of distinctive dress, so you kind of know where they stand. And they land in Sicily and start a revolt there. And pretty much wherever he goes, Italians are just flocking to join his army of red shirts. He's this very charismatic figure, very inspiring figure. And of course, many individuals support Italian nationalism. The numbers have been going up since 1848. So he very quickly brings Sicily under his control and then marches across to the mainland. By September 1860, he has brought not just Sicily, but all of southern Italy under his control, marches north, eventually conquering whatever remains of the Italian peninsula, and then, to his credit, immediately turning over the territories he had conquered to Piedmont. Because again, he's not a political figure. He has no ambitions for power. He is all about Italian nationalism and revolution, and thus becomes established the Kingdom of Italy. On March 17th, 1861, the new Kingdom of Italy is proclaimed under the House of Savoy. The rulers of Piedmont now become the rulers of the Kingdom of Italy. There are still some missing pieces. Venice in English, still under Austrian control. Maybe more importantly, Rome, under the control of the papacy with the support of French troops, who are there as, again, defenders of Catholicism. We discussed that in connection with the Ottoman Empire. But Italy will eventually claim them, right? So what happens, at some point, Austria will find itself at war with Prussia. We'll get to that momentarily. They have to withdraw troops from Venezia, at which point Italy claims it. And then the same kind of thing plays out with respect to Rome. In 1870, the French are going to find themselves at war with Prussia. You're thinking, Prussia kind of popping up quite a bit there. We'll find out what happened with that. But in any event, the French had to withdraw their troops from Rome, at which point Italy annexes it on September 20th, 1870, and makes it its new capital. And now we come to German unification. Here, a little bit different, but in some ways not entirely different, right? So, I mean, in the Italian case, you had two figures who feature prominently in the story of Italian unification. You have Di Cavour, the prime minister of Piedmont. You had Giuseppe Garibaldi, a true revolutionary. In the German case, it really is going to be about one individual. But like in the Italian case, there will be kind of one state leading the way, right? So the Piedmont of the German story of unification will be Prussia. Well, let's kind of go back to 1848 briefly, right? We had the Frankfurt Assembly or Parliament that had failed, and increasingly German nationalists are going to look to the leaders of either Prussia or Austria to bring about unification, right? So instead of it, being from the bottom up, kind of grassroots, looking for someone to impose unification. And we should note, this is actually something not viewed favorably by the rest of Europe. The last thing they want to see is a powerful, unified Germany, like a kind of super state in the middle of the continent, which would completely, upset the balance of power. There'd have to be a complete recalibration of that. So I mentioned in the case of German unification, one individual will, kind of stand out. That is Otto von Bismarck, the Prime Minister of Prussia, appointed in March 1862 by King William I. And he will have a lot of power, in a way, in many ways, much more playing a much more determinative role of German policy than King William I or Wilhelm I. There is a parliament by this point, but it doesn't really have much power, or at least initially it didn't. It's starting to have some influence. And so sometimes it kind of interferes with what Bismarck wants to do. He tries to govern around them mostly by focusing on foreign affairs. And this is where nationalism is going to kind of factor into the equation, right? He is not a German nationalist. But like Di Cavour, he's more than happy to use nationalism in order to strengthen his position vis-a-vis the parliament, and then to promote the kind of policies he wants to put in place. And here's the thing you need to know about Bismarck, right? He is all about Realpolitik, a German term, which, you get a sense of what it's about, right? Translates fairly easily into English. Particularly if you're talking about the 19th century, probably the foremost practitioner of realpolitik. And this is all about, realism, right? This is about, not being driven by ideological considerations or desire for glory or something like that. This is more about, kind of taking a more calculated approach in terms of what is doable, the idea that you should always strengthen your state if at all possible. A bit the ends justify the means. We've seen this kind of thing with, Frederick the Great taking Silesia, or Richelieu, who pursued a policy aimed at strengthening the position of the monarchy and so forth. So again, he's not ideologically driven. He's not a nationalist. He certainly has no grand scheme for German unification, but nonetheless, and to some extent unintendedly, his policies will bring German unification about. So first of all, he is willing to break eggs. He is not afraid to use force, but he's not going to do it if it doesn't mean achieving the goal or if the cost is too great. And he really had this utter disdain for, these German nationalists who had featured so prominently with the Frankfurt Parliament. Very famously had said, "Not by speeches and majorities will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the mistake of 1848-49, but by iron and blood." And I think that pretty much sums it up. So what happens? So a lot of this is going to be a, kind of feeling it out as you go, taking advantage of opportunity that presents itself and so forth. So the first opportunity will be when we start to see large numbers of German nationalists becoming agitated by developments in Denmark. There are two duchies or provinces in Denmark, which is just to the north of Germany. These are Schleswig und Holstein, and they have sizable German minorities. And at some point, rumors are spreading that they are somehow being oppressed. A lot of this is probably highly exaggerated, particularly by German nationalists, who see this as a potential catalyst, towards achieving nationalist goals. And Bismarck is going to see an opportunity here to actually expand territorially by using the kind of anger and frustration felt by German nationalists as a kind of pretext for taking these territories, right? The idea that he's there to save these poor German minorities that are being oppressed. And he's actually going to press Austria to join in what becomes the Danish War. Very short war, 1864, wherein the combined might of Prussia and Austria effectively overwhelmed Denmark, and they gained control of Schleswig and Holstein. At which point they then agree to divide their administration between them. Prussia will take control of Schleswig and Austria of Holstein. But now Bismarck sees a new opportunity that he can actually use this division of administration as a way of increasing Prussia's influence within the German Confederacy at the expense of Austria, by claiming that Austria is somehow mismanaging their territory, that they're not really effectively controlling it. And we're not going to get into the details here, right? But eventually he's going to just start to provoke Austria to the point where Austria finally declares war on June 14th, 1866, starting the Austro-Prussian War. Again, this will be a fairly short war, roughly a month long, and Prussia is going to be victorious. Now this one, obviously a bit more of a risk here, right, than going after Denmark with Austria as your ally. Austria definitely has a huge army, much huger population than Prussia. But in the end, Prussia is victorious largely because of, one, their superior weaponry. And already we talked about how the Prussians were very famous for having a very effective military. But the problem was always, how do you deal with a war on multiple fronts? And they finally kind of figured it out. They're developing a very, very efficient rail system, and its primary purpose, other people can use it. It's connecting many different points within Prussia. But their primary concern in terms of how they lay it out is that it should allow Prussia to move troops quickly from one front to another, right? So, you could have the entirety of your army fight in a given battle, and then when the battle's done, load them on a train and then get them to another front in time to engage a different enemy. And that actually proves to be very advantageous in this conflict. So where does that leave us, right? So, we talked about how, imagine if you were an Italian nationalist, right, after all of the northern part of Italy had become united. Well, you're going to see a similar phenomena happening here, right? So imagine if you're a German nationalist living in a neighboring territory. You're becoming really enthusiastic about what's going on with Prussia, right? From your point of view, it looks like Prussia, it looks like Bismarck, has taken up the mantle of German nationalism, is really fighting for the cause of German unification. Obviously we talked about how Bismarck, it's more the case that he's kind of using German nationalist sentiment in a somewhat cynical way, but maybe even you realize that, but you don't care, right? And there's going to be tremendous pressure on the rulers of neighboring German states to join up with Prussia. And eventually, Prussia is going to bring all of the northern states of the German Confederacy under Prussian control, either directly or indirectly. And it really does feel like a momentum is really building up. Certainly, it feels that way to the rest of Europe, but they're not happy about it, right? They see what seems to be a potential superstate emerging in the center of Europe, and no one is more concerned about that than France. And that is something that Bismarck is already beginning to make calculations regarding. And all of this is eventually going to lead to a third conflict, the Franco-Prussian War. A little bit longer, but again, is going to be a decisive Prussian victory. With the Austro-Prussian War, Prussia had provoked Austria into attacking Prussia. It's going to follow a similar pattern. Prussia is going to provoke France into declaring war on Prussia. Number of factors here, right? First of all, Bismarck understands and realizes he can use this fact that France has a genuine concern about Prussia's growing power in the center of Europe, right? So, you have that. Second of all, we're talking about Louis Napoleon. Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, always under pressure to demonstrate that he can live up to the reputation of his famous uncle. That is something else he can use to manipulate France. And then, so finally, what happens is the ruler in Spain dies. There's going to be kind of a dispute emerging over the succession, with Prussia and France favoring different individuals. And Bismarck is going to use that as a way to provoke France into declaring war. I'm not going to get into the details of it. It involves like forging a letter that would appear to insult Napoleon III. In any event, it works. He's able to goad the French into declaring war, which they do on July 15th, 1870. As is evident, I think, from this political cartoon from the period, France is going to be utterly defeated, right? The figure on the top representing Prussia, looking very, very much like a Teutonic knight. The figure on the ground representing France. The decisive battle, the Battle of Sedan, on September 2nd, 1870, which results in an entire French army and Napoleon III being captured. Well, that is pretty much checkmate. France is forced to surrender shortly thereafter on January 28th, 1871. And the terms of defeat by the standard of the day are going to be brutal. First of all, right after this war, the southern German states rushed to unify with the North German Confederation, right? This momentum has just hit a peak. And so we are going to see the consequence of this, of course, will be a unified German state. France will suffer in two ways, right? They will, first of all, be forced to pay an indemnity, or later on we might use the term reparations, of 5 billion francs, right? So, this is standard practice. If you fight a war, you lose, you have to pay money to the winner to help the winner recover the costs of the war. The ensuing damages, whatever financial investment was involved, militarily, and so forth. The thing is, this is not readily apparent from our modern day perspective, where we talk about the national debt. I don't even know if we have numbers big enough to describe that. But 5 billion francs back then was a lot, right? That seemed unjust. It seemed humiliating, and it's something France will not soon forget. And they are forced to give up Alsace and Lorraine, right? So those two territories that you see in pink there, which Louis XIV had gained with the Treaty of Westphalia, are now going to become part of Germany. And this is something France and just pretty much every red-blooded patriotic Frenchman finds unacceptable. So it's a combination of these two things that are going to create a tremendous level of resentment amongst Frenchmen, one that they will carry with them for decades to come and will constitute a major factor leading to the First World War. Needless to say, after a utterly humiliating defeat like this, Napoleon III's regime collapses. He's done. But as if things weren't bad enough, adding insult to injury, putting salt in the wound, The Germans are going to celebrate their defeat of France and the unification of Germany in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, in the Royal Palace in Versailles, about 45, 50 miles outside of Paris, where they will proclaim Wilhelm I as Kaiser or Emperor of the Second German Empire. And just try for a minute to imagine that you're a Frenchman living at that time, right? After this utterly humiliating defeat by Prussia, you now have this like German superstate on your frontier. Something that you really are quite concerned about. This is really something you're not going to soon forget. Frenchmen are not going to forget this, and it is worth recalling. If probably most of you did know this, that at the end of the First World War, the treaty settling terms with Germany will be the Treaty of Versailles, which is reflects the fact that it is negotiated in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles and signed off on there. And it will be a very, very harsh treaty with respect to Germany. And again, it's not by accident that that treaty is going to be negotiated and signed off on in Versailles, in the same place where this celebration took place. The French will hold a grudge right up to the First World War about this. In any event, that concludes the second part of our lecture. Don't forget the questions, and I'll see you in Latin America.